I'll give you guys a little bit of background about myself, just kind of where I'm coming from, how I got to this point. I sort of grew up here, born and raised in Seattle. I worked for a while as a sort of physical therapy aide back when I was at the University of Washington as a student. I worked on rehab up at Northwest Hospital, and I worked with a lot of folks who were sort of suffering the effects of either stroke or heart attack, or people who had diabetes and had recent amputations. And I had this motivation that I wanted to come back and try to fix it before we got there in that rehab unit. That was always my goal. Full circle, it just turns out that I became a naturopath, and I'm back right where I kind of started, but hopefully with a lot more tools, a lot more information. So with that, I think what's really important is to know what brings you all here. So I want to actually start with a few of the questions that you have today, things that you want to know about, so that way I can tailor some of this information to you specifically, because you're here on your Saturday morning with me. So I'm curious, what questions do you guys have? I'm a teacher, so I do a lot of this, a lot of interaction. But what brought you guys in? Yeah.
Oh, what brought me in, or a question I had?
Or questions.
Okay. My one question is, I know that we're supposed to eat lots of fruit, and I know it's high in natural sugar, so the carbs go up. So how do I balance that, the natural fruits being pre-diabetic?
Okay, so natural fruits. And we'll get to some of these during the lecture, but it's always nice to know ahead of time so I can talk to her. Anything else?
Research suggests there's a pretty strong connection between diabetes and cardiovascular. So I'm hoping we can speak a little bit to what that relationship is about and what causes that to be connected.
Sure. Again, there's huge correlation and direct effects between diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And so it's almost hard to talk about one without talking about the other.
Exercise, aerobic versus strength training, which one is better?
Okay. All right.
A1C, let's see, even though I keep my A1C good, I still have cravings for sweets. But I use willpower really hard not to deal with it. But I'm wondering, will I still end up with heart problems?
Okay. So we'll look a little bit at, again, I'll kind of come back to this cardio-diabetes issue, but also about our foods leading to sort of end effects of diabetes or cardiovascular disease. So we'll say foods, and then how that can affect those complications of these conditions that we are most concerned about, the things that kind of make us worry, make us sort of come back to this point and show up on the Saturday morning.
Yeah, along the food line, I love breads and can't stop eating bread. It's sort of addicted to carbs. So what alternatives are to not eliminate it, but reduce it in terms of getting more carb?
Okay. Probably jump one or two more at some point. We might be a whole morning. We don't have too much time, but I'll take one or two.
Well, this may be in foods, but if you have sugar addiction and chemical sweeteners, so foods that are no sugar, but yet they've got a chemical sweetener in there.
Okay. And you guys can't see this, but I'll just put it here as well. So sweeteners, and then also carbohydrates. Maybe take one more, and then I'll get you guys all set at the end here. So.
Is it possible to get off drugs?
Right. And that's a big question I see all the time from patients who come in to see me in the clinic, is this question about meds. So, I'll try to address as much of that as I can. At the end, we'll come back to some sort of question and answer period. But otherwise, I'll give you guys just a brief overview. Feel free to sort of let me know whether or not some of this is complete review, or if you guys have a little more sort of need for information about sort of the basics. I'm happy to kind of bring that back to you. So let's talk a bit about diabetes prevention. I think that's the sort of most effective time to treat diabetes is in those early stages. Actually, at the time of pre-diabetes is the best time to have the largest effect for people long term. And I'll show you guys some of the research behind that, where that came from. It's something I really enjoy because it gives you a chance to help change the course of the direction when people progress from pre-diabetes into diabetes. One of the problems I see is a lot of patients might come in and heard, oh yeah, I was told I have pre-diabetes and not to worry about it until I develop diabetes. I think that's a horrible, horrible thing to say to anyone. If you have pre-diabetes, you are at the best time to make a change and to actually alter that course of that progression to diabetes over the next, we have research from 4 to 20 years that changing things at the early stages are probably the most effective times to make changes. You still have benefits throughout, but the earlier you start, the better. So, a little bit about kind of the physiology, or what is diabetes, how does this work? As most of you may know, we have this balance of insulin that is secreted into our blood whenever we eat carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are also sugars, is another way to think about this. And your body will produce insulin to help you use that sugar. So it usually goes into your tissues. You'll use it in your skeletal muscles, those muscles that you use when you're exercising or lifting weights. It comes back to that question about aerobic versus sort of resistance training exercises. We also know that our liver helps us produce sugar when we need it. So when you haven't eaten in 12 hours and you're feeling hungry, your liver starts to produce a little bit of sugar for you. Also, when you're very stressed out, and if you have a strong stress reaction, your liver can also kick in and start to produce a little bit of glucose for you. So it's important just to kind of understand these basics. I'm going to talk primarily about type 2 diabetes for today's talk. I could give a whole other talk on type 1 diabetes. But in type 2 diabetes, we see a combination of two things. First, we see that in the early stages, people produce a lot of insulin. You have a lot of carbohydrates and you produce a lot of insulin. That insulin is supposed to open up the door for you. Like in the back, if you think about, you guys are all glucose, your sugar in the blood. Insulin opens the door so that you can walk into muscles and other tissues. In diabetes, in type 2 diabetes, that door doesn't open. It doesn't open very well. So what happens is all that sugar stays in the blood. And then, I use this term quite often, it almost frosts everything. It's kind of like frosted donuts. When we talk about hemoglobin A1C, we're looking at your red blood cells, and we're looking at how frosted they are, how much sugar is on that red blood cell. That tells us a little bit about how much sugar is in your blood over any given amount of time. So we usually look at a hemoglobin A1C over 3 months, and I say, how frosted are your red blood cells over that time period? And that gives us an indication about whether or not you have sort of very difficult problems with your diabetes, or maybe you're just in that pre-diabetes range where we could do a little bit more to bring that down and it may be easier to treat. So, does that make sense? Everyone have a fairly basic understanding? You can kind of nod. I always have my students raise their hands and then drop it. That way it's always easier. Start with participation. Any questions on that so far? Yeah.
I always wonder, how come I didn't hear about diabetes before I got the disease? I didn't hear that much about it. I go to every year, went to the doctor, physical, and nobody warned me about carbs, and now I hear it all over the place.
Right. I think it's one of those problems. One of the things that we'll talk about in prevention is there's a challenge for physicians, and that for the most part, physicians will sort of jump on a disease once it's a disease. And we look at from a full societal problem as being something that's dealt with by a public health entity or our organizations like the American Diabetes Association, who's working to sort of get that message out. The balance is that there needs to be a bit of a cultural change to reduce a lot of those risk factors for diabetes. But many physicians don't have the time to actually sit down and talk with people about how to change those things early. And we talk about that as health promotion. How do you promote health now so that you prevent these diseases from coming up later? And if you have just a few minutes in a visit, it's very hard sometimes to get into that conversation. But I think it's vital to sort of the health of our society and to each individual person that you talk about that early. Talk about it with your kids, your grandkids. Talk to them about their health, what they're doing, what they're eating, their exercise, because then you can save a whole nother generation. So. This I won't talk about too much. It just kind of shows you that we're looking at what happens in your body over time. So this is over 24 hours during the day. And at this point, we'll say this is about 8 a.m. and noon and 7. And what happens is, here's your blood sugar. Your blood sugar goes up after you eat, and your body makes insulin that should be just enough insulin so that you bring that blood sugar into all your tissues. And that's the normal process that we're looking for. I think this is important because it tells you a few things. One of those things is, if you do not have enough insulin, then your blood sugar goes up. Or if you have so many carbohydrates possibly, and you eat a large amount, and you get to that point to where you have more sugar than you can sort of get into your body, then your blood sugar stays up. So either you can have not enough insulin, or you have too much sugar or carbohydrates in your diet. So you can work on those over time. So I'm going to show you guys some interesting statistics, a little bit that came out. It's funny, some of this just came out in the last week, so I just updated some of my slides. But I'll show you guys sort of what we know so far. If we look at the United States as a whole, we do see that diabetes is extremely common. And so it's always sad to hear that we're not talking about that earlier, that people don't know about the risk factors and treat themselves before it becomes a problem. If you guys look at this, here's just a general map of the United States. And if you look down here, you'll see the percentages. These are the prevalence of diagnosed diabetes among adults in the United States in 2010. When we look down here in the South, we see about 9% adult population. So that's 10 out of 100 people may be diagnosed, or 1 out of 10 people sort of diagnosed with diabetes. So it's an epidemic. This is a huge problem in our society. I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer, and this has changed dramatically since, let's say, the 80s. It's changed dramatically. If we look here, even in our own state, we look pretty good up here in the Northwest. So we're not quite such a deep red color, showing a huge prevalence. But even in our own state, and sort of the greater Seattle area, we have a lower prevalence. But in Washington state itself, you can see that over on our coast and other areas of Washington, diabetes is a huge epidemic and a great problem for us. If you look at this, you'll see some of these counties where you have greater than 11% of your adult population diagnosed with diabetes. So for me, there's so much work that needs to be done 20 years ago. So we have to start now to treat 20 years from now, and we also have to work with folks who are dealing with this so that you guys can have the best quality of life, that you can sort of prevent the complications, and that you can treat it in a way where you feel empowered, and also that you walk away feeling educated about diabetes and what it is. And this next slide, this is just the newest research that's come out, sort of the large numbers on diabetes in the United States. This is also happening around the world. If we look here, you can see that the prevalence of diagnosed diabetes in adults from 1988 to 1994 was on a steady rise. Then from 1999 to 2010, it keeps going up. So we're diagnosing more and more and more people with diabetes. It's becoming a massive epidemic. And so for those of you who have diabetes, you're sort of there, we can do everything we can to help you, but I honestly wish I could have helped you 20 years ago. There's things to do now, but I would say that prevention is key for this, for our society, and for most individuals. What we've also found is that there's this very strong correlation with obesity. So this shows obesity over time, and the prevalence of diabetes, or the number of people in the United States diagnosed with diabetes, continues to rise along with obesity. And I don't know if any of you have sort of traveled around the world, but I can tell you I've traveled in Southeast Asia and other places, and what I have seen and what I've heard from talking to physicians in other countries is that sometimes, or what they've noticed themselves, is that this export of fast food and some of this American culture has also brought a higher prevalence of diabetes and obesity to all these countries. So it's a worldwide problem, but it needs to come back down to what we do at home every day. So there's a bit there. These risk factors, like I talked about, for those who are trying to prevent diabetes, and this is just as important for those that have diabetes. Once you have diabetes, your medications are not the fix, the answer, the end. You still have so much that you can do to have both a better quality of life and better control of your diabetes and reduce your risk of complications over time. So the main thing that we know is that sort of physical inactivity is one of the main risk factors. And this is when people are exercising less than 3 times a week. Or it also sort of correlates with the amount of time that you may sit in front of a screen, which is becoming much more common with our kids in our society. And so we need to sort of, I would say, get people back out playing, get people outside. You're in the Northwest, so invest in your umbrellas and some rain gear and sort of get out to Green Lake. But we know that this is a major risk factor and something that we need to address. Other things that raise your risk for diabetes are high blood pressure. If you have immediate family members with a diagnosis of diabetes, and I don't want to sort of put this blame of diabetes that everyone's sort of putting it on themselves. Some people are at greater risk based upon genetics. And it's one of those things where if you have greater risk because everyone in your family has diabetes, you may have to work a little bit harder than the person you're sitting next to today. And it's just one of those things that we're trying to identify more and more over time. But the more risk factors you have, the more that you can do. So the more aware you are of the changes you might want to make to sort of lower that risk of diabetes. And then again, being overweight or obese also raises your risk. And for those of you who have sort of gone to your doctor and you've looked at your cholesterol levels or your lipid levels, when you have high triglycerides, or if your HDL is that good cholesterol, if that's low, then that correlates with a higher risk also of developing diabetes. So if you have any of these, that's the time to sort of pay attention and try to make changes now. We always say sort of a little bit of prevention now translates to huge gains later on. So just an ounce of prevention.
Talk a little bit about what the triglycerides relationship is about.
Yeah. So part of what we see is that, especially in patients who have diabetes or have a problem with insulin resistance, where they're not responding as well, the triglyceride levels correlate with how many carbohydrates we often see people eating. So if there's a high level of carbohydrates, usually we see those triglycerides start to go up. There's also folks who get high triglycerides genetically, and for those folks, it's still a risk factor, but you have to treat that a little bit differently. Maybe harder to do with diet and lifestyle. So if you know that your father or your grandfather or your grandmother or your sister or someone else has very high triglycerides, it may be a genetic cause as well. That could put you at slightly higher risk. Yeah.
For the high blood pressure, is the risk the same if it's treated, or does it matter?
You know, it's a very interesting question. We've looked at that. We know that the complications of diabetes, and as they relate to sort of cardiovascular disease, if you treat the blood pressure, we seem to reduce the risk of a lot of those complications. So that's a heart attack or a stroke. In terms of whether or not it's treated, it seems to be pretty effective if you treat it. However, one of the things that we look at are, you still might have those underlying risk factors. And so when we talk about physical inactivity, or we talk about obesity or being overweight, what we find is that those are still there. We'd rather have people work on those and reduce those risk factors. Otherwise, we're just trying to hold everything down, trying to kind of push and suppress your risk factors, which isn't always quite as effective. So, as I said, prevention is the best cure, but also prevention sort of methods are effective when you have diabetes. It's great. I have a sort of friends who are cardiologists and some endocrinologists, and we've talked about this, and it's one of those things that people sometimes forget, that you can still work on these things even after you've been diagnosed. It's never too late to make changes. So the primary changes that are recommended, the things that we've found sort of through many different studies across several different countries, is actually these basic things. If you can have some moderate weight loss, and this doesn't matter where you start from. So no matter where you start from, up to a 7% body weight loss over time, slowly and surely, that has great effects on reducing your risk for diabetes. And again, like I said, it doesn't matter where you start, it just lowers your risk. Again, if you do not have obesity, nor if you're overweight, this may not be as much of an issue, but for those who are, this can be very helpful. Regular physical activity, as I talked about, we're going to get into this more. I bolded this one because I think it's an easy sounding, yet hard to implement change. Dietary fiber intake, about 14 grams per 1,000 kilocalories per day. And then saturated fat intake, they say less than 7% of your total calories, with a focus on less trans fats. And some of this will sort of come up a little bit later. And then we're going to focus primarily on the Mediterranean style eating pattern. And I really like this Mediterranean style eating pattern because this isn't necessarily a calorie counting meal plan. This is a style of eating where if you sort of look at the foods that are part of that diet, if you eat those, we find that it actually seems to reduce risk of diabetes. So it's impressive. So let's kind of first start with physical activity. And I want to come back to this question here where we talk about sort of exercise and how that's going to sort of work in terms of treating diabetes or the prevention of it. So to prevent diabetes, they say at least 150 minutes per week of physical activity. I have to tell you, I work with a lot of folks with diabetes, and I never tell them to start at 150 minutes of activity. You start with anything. If it means that you just go for one walk one day a week, that's a great way to start. One of the things I've found that's really effective is to find something that's fun, something that you want to do. I've had couples who have said, you know, okay, we'll go walk together at night after dinner. They'll get a little map, they'll say, what are the neighborhoods that we've never been to that we want to see? And then they'll go around and they'll go to some new neighborhood in Seattle, maybe drive there, and they'll walk around the neighborhoods, look at the houses, look at the gardens. They also come back reporting that the relationships feel a little bit better because now they've spent some quality time. So not only are you exercising, but you're also getting something that makes you feel better as a person, helps your relationship, and that can be very helpful. Plus you're both being active about your health. And so those things have been really effective. For those with diabetes, those of you who have blood sugar issues now, when your blood sugar goes up, what we know is that physical activity, let's say after that meal, when your blood sugar is going a little bit higher, if you take a 15-minute walk after each meal, your body uses that glucose or that sugar more effectively. It becomes more efficient, and it actually brings your blood sugar down a little bit more. We also know that if people exercise at night, it seems, that it increases their metabolism, and they also utilize their blood glucose a little bit better. So for those with diabetes, that can be very helpful. It's a balance, as we talk about, between just getting out there and doing aerobic exercise and resistance exercise. Both of them are helpful because what they do is they actually create more doors. So we talk about insulin opens that door for glucose, which helps you lower your glucose. The more you exercise, it's like you're building new doors. So there's more access for glucose to go into the muscles. You burn that energy because you're active. So the more muscle mass that you make, the more doors you've built, so you use it a little bit more effectively. When you're out there and you're sort of doing this aerobic exercise or taking that walk, that's also going to help you now, because you have more doors open, that you can bring more of that blood glucose in after a meal. And so we talk about that balance of both being very important. One or the other, it doesn't matter. If you haven't done anything, start either one of those. Just getting started moving is the most effective thing. One of the things that I love too, I never knew this before, but all my patients who I've seen that have gotten into cycling or maybe gotten into the YMCA or somewhere else have found that not only are they getting into exercise, but they're also finding a community. I've actually been most impressed with those people who started cycling, or those people who got into the YMCA, and now they have friends that they do this with. It becomes a social aspect of their life. Hardest thing to do is to make a new habit. Hardest thing to do is change your daily routine, so it has to feel good. Your blood sugar numbers are, I would say, less important at that point. To actually make this effective, you have to feel good doing whatever it is that you're trying to do to improve your health. So those are the main things on exercise that we see. Definitely that balance between aerobic and sort of weight lifting, and just a little bit's fine. If you're not very mobile, you can even do a sit and be fit. There's programs where you can kind of sit down and just do arm exercises, or if you have knee pain, some of those things will help. You can go to a community center and use one of the wading pools and sort of get into a pool aerobics course. And all of that can be really sort of fun and helpful for you to get active. And it's easier on your joints in the pool. So I want to show you a little bit, and this is why I'm so interested. Look at the United States first and kind of see what have we done here, right? These are the people who we think are sort of most like us. How have we been able to prevent diabetes? And I like this because I want to focus on what works. We know what happens and what makes diabetes occur for most folks, but we don't know what are people doing right that's helping them prevent developing diabetes. So the largest thing that we've seen so far is this diabetes prevention trial here in the United States. And what they found is that by incorporating those preventative measures we talked about, that weight loss, those changes in diet, that with those, people have been able to avoid progression fairly well. They compared this to metformin. Now, if any of you have diabetes, you know that metformin is the first medication everyone ends up on. And that's our best medication for treating diabetes. However, what I'm going to show you I find is really interesting. When we look at what happened, we said, here's people who are at risk of developing diabetes. We can give you the diabetes medication, we can give you a placebo, or we can have you really work on changing these lifestyle factors. This blue line is just the placebo. So this is a sugar pill. They were kind of told this pill will help you, take this, it'll help you prevent diabetes. We still see that many of these people, if we look at sort of the incidence of diabetes, many of these people, up to 40%, were developing diabetes over 4 years. Those who were taking the medication for diabetes, which if you develop diabetes, you'd be on that medication anyways, it reduced it by about half, which is pretty impressive. But if we then compare those lifestyle changes, you see that that's actually dramatically different than doing nothing at all. And it's even better than the best medication that we have for the first-line treatment of diabetes. So I really do suggest to most folks that this is the place to start. Even the big guidelines, they talk about these things as the basis of treatment, but then they cover it up with all the medications. So you can still work on these factors and reduce your need for medications. If you have early diabetes, people can actually get their blood sugar well regulated and get to a point to where they may not need metformin, even after development of diabetes. And like I said, most of my patients I've seen that with are the ones who start cycling and really changing their diet. There's a tipping point where most people, if you've had diabetes for a few decades, you're not making enough insulin, and it becomes very hard to come off medications. You can still have benefit from these things, but it's always a continual balance. So what they found in those who were trying to prevent diabetes, they looked at then sort of that diabetes prevention program, and they said, what are the outcomes? What happened with these folks? And what they found was that the more often you were able to get your blood sugar under control with diet and lifestyle, the lower your risk over time of developing diabetes and having to be on the medications and all the management, everything that goes along with it. So again, I take this as a nice sort of reminder that we all fall off the wagon. No one's perfect. No one goes out there, makes every change and is perfect and never slips up and goes and, you know, kind of falls off their exercise routine for a few weeks or a month. However, if you can dust yourself off, get back to it, find a way to become sort of habitual in these preventative activities, it's going to help you in the long run. So even if you fall off, if you get back on, that's really what matters. And we see that that worked out for many folks over time here in the United States. If we go and we look throughout other countries, such as in Asia, we found they have a 20-year follow-up study on diabetes prevention. Looks very much like what we saw in the United States. At 20 years, it sort of comes together a little bit more. However, even after 20 years, these folks are doing much better, which is, to me, impressive. It means that there's some sustainability. If you make these changes, we also see what we call legacy effect. This is fascinating. It might actually change partially how people are treated for diabetes in the future. We know that if we can get the blood sugar well regulated, that your body remembers that. And even if sort of things get a little bit worse after that, your body somehow almost resets, and those people have less problems 20 years later. So getting healthy at any point, the earlier you can get healthy, you get more benefit 10 years later. We didn't think that would happen, but that became sort of evident in this research where there's a legacy effect. Take care of yourself now, and you will actually reap the benefits 10 years down the line. So less complications of sort of diabetes. You don't have quite the sort of progression into uncontrolled diabetes. So it's very, very promising to me to see that these things can be effective. And then we'll also go over to Europe. They do a lot of fun work on this. There's this huge trial or actually more of a study where they're watching Europeans in 8 different countries, and they look at what do these folks do? How are they able to prevent diabetes in their own countries? And they're looking at over 340,000 people. So it's a pretty good sized study. And what they have found is that there are specific dietary habits that seem to correlate with development of diabetes. And we're going to talk about how these relate to things like the Mediterranean diet. The first one is that we know that the higher amount of processed meat you have, processed meat, even greater than red meat, processed meats, so the deli meats and things like that, if you're eating a large amount of that during your week, so you're going to that deli, getting that sandwich every day, maybe having sort of red meat at dinner, that does increase your risk of diabetes substantially. And so trying to find other ways to sort of reduce processed meats and red meats can be a very effective way. Most people get really stuck on carbohydrates. They think that diabetes is all about carbohydrates. But we also know that things like meat intake can affect sort of your risk of developing diabetes. I like this one. I think it's also very interesting because they didn't tell you exactly what tea, but they looked at across these 8 different European countries at tea drinking. And they found that sort of no matter what that tea is, they had to exclude Italy and Spain. I'm guessing there was probably a bit more coffee in those countries instead of tea drinking. But for people who are drinking tea about 4 times a day, there seemed to be a substantial sort of decreased risk associated with developing diabetes.
One kind of tea better than another?
That's the trick question. So we're still looking, we think that maybe green teas, black teas, that there may be something to those. They may be higher in antioxidants and other protective sort of constituents of food that we find to be helpful for our bodies. They decrease inflammation. We think that diabetes also is part of this inflammatory process. That's why cardiovascular disease is made so much worse by diabetes, because diabetes is a very inflammatory disease. You have a lot of glucose in your body, It causes everything to get inflamed. It's like your blood vessels feel sore. There's a bit of inflammation, and then it progresses some of the problems in atherosclerosis that you see.
One of the things about processed meat, since I was in the industry, that most people don't know, you raise the sugar level, you can raise the salt level,
right,
and you can't tell it. So they can load it with salt, but add a little sugar, it don't taste salty, but the salt does the same thing to your body because it don't change. It's regular salt. And that was one of the tricks that I learned. Plus, salt also helps hold a little more moisture. It's nice and moist.
Right.
Salt and certain other sodium chemicals hold water, and it's a sodium chemical that does that. Sodium phosphate put in meat will cause it to hold water and be moist for a long time.
You know, it's one of those things that comes up all the time, and especially here at Bastyr, we talk about this idea of whole foods diets, trying to get local. I mean, we've been talking about going out to a small farm, you know, up in Monroe to get a cow that you split with a bunch of your friends and have some of your meat from that source is probably a bit better because you know where it's coming from. It's not necessarily pumped full of extra things to make it look good for you as a consumer. And again, we talk about whole foods as being important because if you go home and you make it and you're working with the raw materials, then you're the one who's adding the salt, so you have that control. So the more that you can bring it back to your own kitchen, back to your own family, back to your own area, the more control you have in terms of what it is that you're getting in your body. And we think about this with all processed foods altogether. It can be hard. Sometimes you have to make those choices of where you go to get the meats and talk to people. Ask the butcher, ask the people at the store, and kind of take that ownership of your food and what you're eating, because it does matter. One of the other things that we found is that high protein intake, and this is primarily animal protein intake, was also associated with an increased risk of diabetes. Now, the behaviors, again, like I said, what are the positive things that we see? And the positive things that we find are if you have sort of a risk or several risk factors for diabetes, and you're eating a large amount of protein, you might want to tell yourself, hey, if I do what a lot of these folks in Europe are doing, if I start to replace some of that animal protein with beans, legumes, nuts, sort of some of these ancient grains such as quinoa, that those can be an effective source of protein that is not associated with an increased risk of diabetes. So it's a really nice way to sort of bring some of that in to change habits.
Is that true for fish also as a high protein source?
You know, they didn't specifically bring out fish. They did sort of go through poultry versus red meat in terms of protein sources. But we would say that overall, all the other studies and evidence that we found shows that fish is also a more protective food. If you can, you want to get sort of cold water, salmon, things like that. It's nice being here in the Northwest. We have easier access to those types of foods. But that seafood a few times a week seems to be effective. Eating fish a few times a week, 3 times a week, is probably better for you than taking a fish oil supplement unless you have a medical condition that requires possibly using fish oil to treat it. It seems overall through the research that it's actually a more effective way to get your fish oil in your diet. I bring that up too because we're not talking about supplements, we're not talking about a lot of other sort of specific, sort of molecules or nutrients that I'm going to tell you to take. Because if you're eating a diet that increases your risk of diabetes, and you take a couple of supplements on top of it, it doesn't make up for the fact that your diet is probably the largest impact piece of your risk of diabetes. Supplements may be helpful, I think, once you develop diabetes. Some of it may be a little bit more protective, we think, when you look at prevention, but none of them seem to be even close to changing these risk factors initially. So I sort of hold on to this, and if you need a little bit more on sort of supplements and what's that advice, and we're happy to talk to you and kind of give you a little more research, but it takes a bit more time. So that's why I focus here. And I think one of the sort of most interesting trials that they've done where we look at risk of diabetes and also cardiovascular disease is this PREDIMED trial. And this is one that's done in sort of the Mediterranean, and they were looking at over 3,000 high-risk Spanish individuals. They were a bit older. They had high risk for developing diabetes. A lot of these people also had cardiovascular disease. And they looked at their diets and they said, how can we help these folks, or what are the habits of these people that help them prevent progression to diabetes? They looked at sort of the Mediterranean diet. They also gave these people a little bit of extra sort of foods to add to their diet. They said either we're going to give you more olive oil, and we want you to incorporate more olive oil into your diet, and they did that at about 50 milliliters per day, or we're going to give you extra walnuts, and we're going to have you eat extra walnuts every day. For prevention of diabetes, it actually turned out that more olive oil seemed to be even better than those walnuts. Now, walnuts have their own cardiovascular benefits, so I still suggest that, but it just shows that olive oil, sort of in a cooking style where you're not frying too much with it, they'll oxidize it and take away some of those positive properties. But if you use that sort of on salads and vegetables, and use that as one of your agents to help flavor your food, to help you kind of beat that need for sweets or salty, that can be a very effective way to decrease your risk. So I want to bring this back home and actually make it a little bit useful for you, and then we'll sort of talk about some of this afterwards and places where it didn't fit in the talk. But I want you guys to do a little something for me. I want you to think about what it would take to incorporate some of these positive behaviors that decrease your risk. And for those of you that have diabetes, think about how these behaviors might also help you with your current state of diabetes, because it will be effective in both areas, both prevention and treatment. So I always joke about this. I think with a Mediterranean style diet, if I lived here, I would do everything I could do to live as long as possible and have the best quality of life and be able to walk around and enjoy it. So I think that, you know, they figured it out to an extent down there in the Mediterranean. And of course, if home looked like that, wouldn't you too? So I want to see, I don't know if you guys can all see this. I hope you can. If not, I'll read it to you. So this is a questionnaire that helps us as doctors figure out whether or not you're eating a diet that closely matches what these folks in the Mediterranean are eating, because we know that it seems to decrease risk. And if we can get you eating a diet closer to this, that we can help you lower your cardiovascular risk factors, because this trial also showed cardiovascular benefits, as well as decreasing risk of diabetes. So the major things are this. Do you use olive oil as a main culinary fat? So is olive oil something that you have on your counter in your kitchen that you are using when you cook each day? If yes, you get a point. And actually, let's just talk through this. I want you guys to give yourself a point for every single one of these that you do. So grab your sort of pen and that piece of paper, and then we'll ask these questions and then give yourself a point for each. So do you use olive oil as your main culinary fat? The second one is, how much olive oil do you consume in a given day? And if you use more than 4 tablespoons, and kind of think about the size of a tablespoon, use more than 4 tablespoons, you get a point. And this is how many vegetable servings do you consume per day? And this is greater than at least 2 portions raw, or more than 1 as a salad. So you're eating, and think about portion sizes almost like a handful, right? A handful of that food. Are you at least eating sort of 2 handfuls of raw vegetables? You know, whether that be some carrots, or you're looking at some peppers, something along those lines. Or are you having sort of a large salad that has a bunch of this in it?
Does it matter whether it's cooked or raw?
In the end, not so much. There's some debate. If you actually cook some of these things, some of the phytochemicals become more available to you to digest. But also, if you were to make this into a smoothie, you might lose some of the fiber that helps you lower your cholesterol. So there's trade-offs between always cooked or pureed or just raw vegetables. But it does count as long as you have sort of more than 2 servings before you then cook that down. The fruit units, this is interesting. In Europe, this includes fruit juices, but I say in America, this does not include those fruit juices with a bunch of sugar added or something that looks, or orange-like substance, right? Or if they had to put the natural flavorings into something that is a whole food, then there's a problem, right? Orange juice should taste like orange juice. So if they add an extra sugar, it doesn't count. But if you consume at least more than 3 servings of fruit per day, that seems to be protected, and you get a point. This is really hard, I think, for a lot of folks with diabetes because they're concerned about fruits. When we look at fruit intake, it may bring up your blood sugar a little bit, but long-term, fruit intake does not seem to be a negative thing. We'd much rather have you eating fruit than have you eating some type of processed carbohydrate. Because you're also getting fiber with it. You're getting other more protective antioxidants from fruit. So again, if you're eating fruit more than 3 servings a day, you also get a point. In terms of red meat, if you have less than 1 serving per day, it's less than 1 serving of red meat per day, you get a point. But if you're eating sort of a sandwich at lunch with red meat and then you're having a steak at dinner, then you don't quite get that point. And then servings of butter. If you have less than 1 serving of butter, margarine, or cream, you get a point. So you can start to see some of these, right? Some of these habits, what this diet looks like. It's really trying to reduce processed meat in red meat. It's increasing use of things like olive oil. It's trying to sort of find a lower amount of things like creams or margarines or butter. It says how many sweet or carbonated beverages do you drink per day? Less than 1. That's one of the easiest things, I think. If you can start getting away from some of those sodas and stuff that we have out there, even the ones with artificial sweeteners can be effective. And I tell people, even like those little emergency packs, even though it's sweet, if you can find something to change your taste, it's going to be helpful. So trying to get away from carbonated beverages, get some sparkling water and squeeze some lime in it. Maybe you need 2 limes to start, but over time it could then become 1. It can get a little bit easier. You can kind of come off of that need for sweet or salty. And then wine, my wife looked at this and thought it said per day, which she laughed at quite a bit. How much wine do you drink per week? This is more than 7 glasses per week. They say on average, again, for men you don't want more than 2. You start to lose the benefits. For women, more than 1. But if you're having a little wine, that's good. If you guys are reading about natural substances, you probably hear about resveratrol, which is one of those substances that we think is quite protective for cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Especially down here in sort of southern Spain and these places, that resveratrol comes from the stems of those berries, right, that they use for making that wine. So that old world wine, like that stuff has some of the highest concentration of things like resveratrol. We think that's part of the reason why these folks in the Mediterranean were doing so well. Olive oil, resveratrol, high antioxidants, low red meats, and that would seem to correlate with this longevity and lower risk of some of these diseases.
What about, they say grape juice? See, some folks drink alcohol, so they drink grape juice.
Grape juice?
A dog juice, the same from the same berry the wine is basically made out of.
Right. Except you don't always get the same concentration of resveratrol. And that's part of what they're looking at. Plus, from a cardiovascular standpoint, that red wine seems to help a little bit to keep your blood a little bit thinner. Grape juice, for the most part, has a higher sugar content. And so in that case, that's when you're going to see spikes in blood glucose a little bit more. Again, probably better as long as you're not getting added sugar within that grape juice. At some point, it starts to lose benefit.
So you're saying red wine is better than white wine?
You know, from a cardiovascular standpoint, yes. I would say that from a cardiovascular standpoint. For the most benefit. You know, that little bit of wine, you don't want too much, of course, but in moderation, that little bit seems to be cardioprotective or keeps you from sort of developing some of those events that are related to sort of coagulation in your body.
So what is the recommended red wine?
Right.
What is a glass?
Right. So a glass is just sort of, remember it's not some huge sort of goblet. but just those basic small wine glasses, you know, about halfway full. You can kind of imagine that. If you can fit in your hand like this, it's about halfway full, that is a glass of
So
wine.
you can have 4 ounces, 8 ounces.
Right, 4 ounces. It's a great question because people bring that up sometimes. They're drinking huge glasses and that's a few servings.
I know you made the distinction between like juice in your European countries and then here.
Right.
Is there a difference in the type of wine here? I don't drink, so.
Right. You know, overall, it's kind of a funny thing, a little bit of a tangent, sorry. But for the most part, if you really want to look at sort of the best resveratrol content in wines, they look at old world wines, southern Spain, the ones where they use the old style, where they still have the stems. And when they're pushing out that's where you get that higher concentration of resveratrol. You probably aren't going to get that with your grapes in the same way. It's not going to be that old world style of making wine. So, southern Spain. One more quick aside, it may be of interest to you. I think this is a fascinating story. My own father, we were talking about this, and he got to a point to where he saw his cholesterol going higher. He saw his blood pressure going higher. He saw all these things getting a little bit worse, and he's in his 70s. And he heard about a pilgrimage across the north of Spain. And he started training, walking around Lake Union. He just walked a few blocks at first, getting started with exercise. He got to the point to where, as a retired man, he was walking around Lake Union 6 times training for this for a few years. And he went to Europe, spent a month walking across the north of Spain to the ends of the earth at Finisterre. He lost weight, his blood pressure went down, his cholesterol went down, blood sugar improved. He had meaning and purpose, something to do. He was feeling better. He's in the south of Spain, so if you're gonna have wine, that's the best place to have it. All those things came together. And that was a very real way for him to impact his health, right? He didn't need every sort of other medication that was about to be prescribed. He made the changes then and found something fun to do. And now he's been to Hadrian's Wall up in England. He's going back to Spain. At some point, I hope to go and walk with him in Spain. These are great habits, things that like you can then incorporate into your life in a very fun way. If you can't do it, they have little paths even here in Seattle. They have pilgrimages in Seattle. People that do walks all the time. There's many opportunities here to get active.
Since wine is made from grapes, do you have the same benefit from eating red grapes or white grapes?
Right. We haven't seen it.
And maybe the stems?
Yeah. You know, we haven't seen tons of research on it, but I would say there's a possibility. It's not going to be above and beyond all the other recommendations, but I would say if you can get good grapes, not necessarily just huge pumped up sweet ones, but some of those good grapes, then you're going to get some of the more antioxidant qualities out of that. And the skins as well.
Organic ones would be good.
Right.
They're pumped up sweet grapes? What kind of grape is that?
You're talking about, when you just look at some of those kind of white grapes and everything else, they don't have quite the same high content as some of those sort of darker berries, right, or darker grapes.
I've always informed the darker grapes are better than the green.
Right.
Green grapes are not that great for you.
Right. So there's more antioxidants within those dark pigments, actually, than there are in some of those other ones like the green grapes. So I digressed way too much on that one, sorry. I hope it was helpful. You guys still tracking your points? Mm-hmm. Okay. So how many servings of legumes do you consume per week? And so this is beans. Now remember we talked about margarine, so this is kind of beans without adding a whole lot of extra butter or something to them. But if you're having sort of more than 3 servings of beans, then that's a very beneficial thing. Beans are also a great plant source of protein. So if you can incorporate more beans into your diet, maybe cut out that red meat once or twice a week, that's a really effective way to make some progress there, to sort of change those dietary behaviors.
Does hummus count on that as a bean?
Hummus would count on that. And then also, how many servings of fish or shellfish? Do you have more than 3 servings per week? If you have that, you get a point. How many times per week do you consume commercial sweets or pastries? If you have sweets or pastries less than 3 times a week, that's protected. What I find nice about that is that if you have that one sweet that one day that week, it doesn't mean you've destroyed all the hard work you've done. It means don't have 5 more that week. It just means really practicing that moderation. And if you do get hungry for sweets, eat some plant-based proteins. Keep those walnuts in your car. Keep something there. And if you want a sweet, maybe have a tiny little bit of dark chocolate nibs with your walnuts. That may help satisfy some of that and as well have health benefits and keep you from wanting to then binge or consume a lot on sort of some pastry or sweet later on. Other things, how many servings of nuts, so including peanuts, do you consume per week? So if you have nuts more than 3 times a week, that's also protected. So again, I would say kind of walnuts and olive oil, make those things part of your regular diet. You're going to see benefits for diabetes, but you're also going to see benefits for cardiovascular disease.
On peanuts, how about peanut butter? It's
peanut butter.
pretty natural.
Now, if you have natural peanut butter, like it's just ground and you're not adding a bunch of extra stuff, that seems to be, again, sort of a better choice when you're looking at your protein source. So yeah, if you had to choose between peanut butter that was natural and made from peanuts, not, I'll say Jeff, maybe I shouldn't say that I'm being recorded, but right, that's a better way to go. And again, it's about replacing. So you need some protein. But if you're going to eat protein, try to get it from plants instead of your red meats and other things that you might jump to. And then also, do you preferentially consume chicken, turkey? This is a little bit European here, rabbit meat, instead of veal, pork, hamburger, sausage. So again, those lighter meats are going to be a little bit more sort of protective. For that, you get a point. And then how many times per week do you consume vegetables, pasta, rice, or other dishes seasoned with sofrito? This is a very European thing. Sofrito is that sort of Spanish sauce that's made combination of tomato, onion, leek, and garlic simmered in olive oil. Now, if you can make that, make that. It's very, very good. It's tasty, it's a nice thing to incorporate. But they found that if people were eating that 1 to 2 times per week, that also showed a protective sort of effect. What I say about this is that it's not all the individual pieces. Just doing one in excess is not going to change the course of your risk. It's about all of this as a dietary habit, right? What you don't see here, again, like I said, is you don't see a high consumption of processed foods and sweets. What you don't see here is a high consumption of red meat. What you're finding is an emphasis on fruits and vegetables in their natural form as much as possible. You're finding plant-based proteins, such as nuts and legumes, as a standard part of your diet. Finding a little bit of red wine, a much better choice than maybe having, even a glass of Coke, I would say, right? A glass of Coke, I'd tell you to do wine over that in a heartbeat. All of these things together seem to improve your health. And what's great is that it's not a calorie counting type of diet. It's just something to incorporate, to keep in mind. I bring into my office a whole thing of walnuts or almonds and just kind of rotate that, so that's just a snack every day, and come in with a piece of fruit or something, so that when you feel like you want to eat something, you have it available.
What you don't have lamb, I noticed that you do have rabbit in there.
Right.
So what about lamb? The same as other red meat, right?
Lamb, I'm guessing, would be under the same one. I just can't remember whether or not they did have that on their questionnaire. But lamb, again, for the most part, I got to go back and say this with absolute certainty that lamb would still be a better meat.
The fat is better. It's lanolin instead of a lot of these beef oils that you have.
Right. So those are the basics. Now what I want you to do, think about that questionnaire and add up your points. So I want you guys to quickly add up your points and see how many you have. Okay. And if there's anything you can do, what I'll tell you is evaluate. If you want to make one change, think about this diet and say, did I have less than 7 points? If you have less than 7 points, your diet does not reflect a Mediterranean style diet. So if you wanted to sort of incorporate something now to help yourself prevent diabetes, or those that do have diabetes, if you want to create healthier dietary decisions to control it, if you have less than 7 points, there's a lot of room for improvement, a lot of places to grow. You have a lot of options that you can then incorporate. For those of you who are 7 to 10, I'd say you're getting much warmer. You're pretty close to the Mediterranean diet, not quite there. The best you could have really is 14 points. And if you have 14 points, magnifico. You're there. You're sort of in that Mediterranean style of diet. You're probably more likely to reap the benefits. What I didn't talk about, what I would also add to this whole sort of style of living, is the way that you feel about stress. Trying to take that walk at night is helpful, right? If you feel good about what you're doing, we know that most people have things like heart attacks on Mondays. When people feel really stressed, like their health is, they're feeling anxious and they feel like it's going to kill them, it's more likely to. When you feel like you're stressed or you're trying to make changes, but you know it's good for your health, you also secrete oxytocin in your body, which makes you feel better. It also makes you feel like you want to go talk to your friends about it. It makes you want to connect with that coworker who is also trying to eat healthier. And that connection then makes you feel good and helps you stick with these habits. So the way that you feel about taking care of your health dramatically affects how successful you are with it. The more that you can try to get other people involved, your sort of partners, family, it's a great time to sort of get other people in it with you who want to make changes. Get people walking. My dad's got my uncle walking, my brother and I were walking, and we were all always trying to walk with our father. Get everyone else around you involved because it's so much easier, right? Have friends over for dinner and try to eat like this with them. Talk about the food. Drink that wine while you're making your food. It actually starts the digestive process early so that you get the most nutrients out of those foods. So there's all these little things that you can do during this process. And what I'd say is, if you have anything less than 10 to 14 points, pick one thing. Pick one thing to change. You might just say, I'm gonna go buy some olive oil. Keep it in my kitchen, use it a little bit more often in my diet. If you can do one thing, that is the best way to start. Just one change. Anything on the list, one change will be a healthier habit that you might start up. Again, sort of some take-home points are first, diet and lifestyle are the most effective therapies. They're the most natural. They're not the most sexy, right? If I said, I got a magic pill to fix this for you, people love it. I wish I had it, but we don't. So I really have to get down to that nitty-gritty place of rolling up the sleeves and saying, let's try to make this work in your real life. Let's make it day to day. So diet and lifestyle are proven to be really the most effective therapies for prevention. The things that we find in those diets are very helpful. If you can't incorporate all of that, sometimes, yes, a little supplement here and there may help. But I would say this is really the way to do it. And once you have diabetes, this is still the way to do it. So if your doctor's not giving you that time to talk about this, make them take the time. Or try to get in a diabetes support group, or come see us here at Bastyr. There's a lot that we can do to kind of help you with this process. Other thing I'd say is, for exercise, just start moving. Just even one day a week or at a lunch break, if you go for that one walk, if you make a habit out of it, it's much easier to start up and do more exercise. Here in Seattle, it's the best time to start. Right? We're just going into a dry season, a little bit of sun. If you give yourself about those 3 months of activity, by the time we get back into dreary Seattle weather, you knew how good it felt to be more active, and most people find other ways and avenues to get there, right? People will say, okay, I can go and sort of walk around in the mall a little bit, I just need to move. That's what I want you guys to feel. I want you to find a way to get yourself motivated to just be moving daily, if possible. The Mediterranean diet I focused on, because it seems to decrease risk, it incorporates so many of the things that you guys will read about in terms of antioxidants and supplements and dietary patterns and behaviors. The Mediterranean diet has almost all of that incorporated into it. So if you can just make those small changes, it's very easy. Plus, you don't have to sit there and count calories. It's not as regimented, which means it feels better. You don't feel like you have a prescription. You feel like you're actually enjoying the process and trying new foods, which I like. And then one of the last things I would say, hopefully you're walking away a little bit more motivated. You kind of see that there's a few small things you can do to start. If you're going to make change, I use a technique here with my students, and we do this on our shift, is we use a 5A technique. It's the technique that they found that is useful to help people stop smoking. If there's any hard behavior to quit, it's smoking. And if you want to change to a healthier behavior, that's where all the research says that we struggle the most as a society, and we struggle as doctors. We have a hard time helping you figure out how to make the changes we're asking you to make. If I just said, welcome to Bastyr, now go out and be healthy, how many of you can go and just change your lives like that? No one. I mean, it's rare. Only my few type A folks come in and they're ready. And they leave and they're special. They're their own group of people that can do that. For most people, it has to be a slow, steady process. So what we say is that to really make those changes, you need firm goals. You need only a few, right? Just a few goals. They need to be individualized. That's why I didn't tell you what to do on that Mediterranean diet. I said, you pick something that you want to do. You're more likely to do it if you are empowered and you chose that decision, that way that you are going to improve your health. Reasonable. I can't fly all of you to the Mediterranean to live for 6 months. If I could, that would be a great career as a doctor. So in the meantime, what we have to do is we have to say, how can you incorporate this here at home? What can you do? So it needs to be something that you can bring into your life. That's why I say not everyone here is going to run out and become a cyclist. That's not reasonable. But if you're going to go out and you can say, hey, I can take a walk at lunch with my coworker, or I can take a walk at night with my partner after dinner, that's reasonable. You can. You may feel better with it. And the last one is measurable. We like to measure things because then we can see some progress. So if you say, I'm going to do this 2 times a week, do it 2 times a week. Put it on the calendar. My wife and I mark our exercise on our calendar just to kind of keep ourselves on it. And if we fall off, we see the calendar, we're like, oh, that was a bad week, let's get back on it. And you keep going. So it's a really good way to sort of motivate yourself. It takes a long time for these things to become habits. So you have to keep yourself going long enough to where you feel so good and it's just what you do, and it's just like getting up and brushing your teeth. You want these habits to be like brushing your teeth, just what you do. When you go to the store, you just want to be buying these foods because that's just the way that you live. And that's going to have the most benefit.
Would the greater benefit be walking after eating rather than before eating?
Yes. So we know, especially after you walk, and we'll kind of jump into more question and answer, and I'll address some of these, is that after you eat your meal, we want you to have all your blood flow go to your digestive tract when you sit down and eat. And even if you're sitting there and you're making your food and you're smelling the food, you start the digestive process the minute you cut up that first, pepper. You smell it, that picks it up, it starts kicking in your digestion. Your blood flow all moves to your stomach and your digestive tract. When you eat that food, you're going to digest it easier. Then you're talking about 30 minutes, 45 minutes after that meal. You've done a pretty good job so far digesting it. You feel pretty good. You get up and you walk. At about that period after you eat, that's when your blood sugar starts to go up. So before it hits that peak, if you're exercising, you walk half an hour after dinner, you then bring that blood sugar back down into a normal range. So that can be very helpful to people with diabetes. Taking that walk after dinner is going to help you be more effective in lowering your blood sugar. So if you test your blood sugars, after meal blood sugars look better. If you're walking at night, you'll also find that your morning blood sugars may start to look better. And then over 3 months, you hopefully see your hemoglobin A1C numbers reflect those changes. And that's huge. You have the ability to change those numbers with your behaviors. It doesn't have to be all with medications. And I've had folks who have been on metformin and come off of it. I've had folks who have been on insulin and actually get down to the point where maybe they didn't need insulin, right? And we're just on other medications. Not everyone can get off completely, but at the right point, you can with enough activity.